much, Rami. So thank you very much, Rami. Hopefully you can hear me. So let me just share my screen with everybody. Here we go. Put that into presentation mode. So first of all, thank you very much to Rami, to FedEx, to Memphis, to Christine and Blockchain901. It's great to be here, and hello to everybody. I've got about 20 or 25 minutes of presentation here, 15 minutes or so, 15 pages or so of slides today. And what I want to talk about is something that interests me a lot, which is how will the token economy affect the incumbent enterprise business? And we've called this presentation From Private Clubs to the Token Economy. Right now, we're used to the central database and the very centralized view of the world. How might enterprises have to adapt as we move to a more token economy, and particularly marketplaces and platforms? So that's the question that I want to try and answer for you today. But before I start my slides, let me quickly introduce myself. So I have to tell you that my son on the left-hand side there is now 19 years old, and he's doing his first year maths at Bath University. So you can see what working for IBM has done to me for the last 18 years. But I've been interested in blockchain since about 2015, 2016. And I got super lucky in that I managed to join IBM's blockchain platform unit when it was formed in early 2017. And we were formed with a mission to take blockchain from research and take it out across the wider IBM. And I managed to create a job for myself, which was to work with these new ecosystems and networks that we were building, and to help them build business cases and business models for this new way of working, this collaborative way of working. And I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of networks over the last 4 or 5 years. What I want to do today is only look backwards a little bit, and mostly look forwards. And I want to share with you what I think is going to come as the enterprise moves towards the token economy. And this is my personal opinion. It's a little speculative. This is how I think things are going to pan out. I'm starting to see some of these patterns come into the experimental mode, a few starting to get a little bit more serious. But this is very much my own personal view. So let's kind of set the scene a little bit. And if I do look backwards over the last 4 years, I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to enterprise blockchain. And I would say that if there's one really big lesson that I think I've learned, it's whatever you do, don't just replicate the world as it is in this new technology. What we really have to do is ask ourselves, well, what's changed and what's the problem that we're fixing? And I've kind of come to the conclusion that the problem that we're fixing is about power. And it's about power in marketplaces. And if you think about blockchain, my keys, my asset, no one can tell me what to do with my assets in this new token economy. So we're seeing a movement of power from the center to the edge. So that's the first key thing. The second thing is, in IBM, we talk about blockchain being a team sport. This is not something you can do on your own. And we do have to start thinking about these new types of collaborative business models. And being in the enterprise, I typically start in the business to business part of the marketplace and then moving into the consumer. And I see there being a very definite marriage between private enterprise blockchains and public open networks coming together, and where the dividing line between the two will become very gray. And I think the magic source, if I look backwards, or rather if I look forwards, I think the magic source is going to be the incentive models to drive this collaborative behavior. And this is where I think the utility token, really is going to become phenomenally important. And I'm going to talk about how I think that utility token could be very useful, moving forward. But just kind of setting the scene a little bit, I called this presentation, I called this presentation from the private club to the token economy. So where are we starting from in terms of this private club? And I'm going to tell a story that I heard initially from a chap called Paul Brody, who leads Blockchain for Ernst Young. And I thought it was a super story, so stolen it from him. And what Paul reminded us is this problem of power in marketplaces is something that we've had for a long time. This is a problem that's always been there, really. And he talked about the airlines, and he said, well, if you go back to the 1970s, IBM was working with American, and we created this wonderful ticketing application for them. And then the markets were deregulated, and this ticketing business was spun off as a utility to service the market. And what happened was this ticketing organization ended up having a larger market cap than the airlines. And you think, gosh, how on earth did this happen? And of course, what had happened was the ticketing organization had this wonderful view of the market. They could see all of the customers, all of the passengers, they could see all of the tickets, all of the prices, and they could use this information to grow the center and grow their business and eat into the business of the airlines. So these central databases are a real problem for collaboration and sharing of data in these shared processes if you can't trust that central database. If you can trust the central database, that private club model can work really, really well and can be very successful. But if that data is really valuable, think of these poor airlines, you don't want to give it up. You want to keep control of that. So you want to move to this token economy where we have this decentralized and distributed model where you are governing your own data and you are deciding who sees that data. And we want a very open environment where everyone can join so we can get lots of network effects. And also with the token economy, of course, we're now moving into a much more liquid environment. So these business to business systems are typically very batch oriented today. So they're very slow. So as we move towards the digital environment, then it becomes a whole load more liquid. And then the final piece, of course, is around identity. And we'll talk about identity quite a bit, but I think the different patterns of how we solve the identity problem around how you own your own digital identity on the internet is going to become increasingly important as we move forward. And then finally, when we look at the incentive model and the monetization, we're moving from a winner takes all to a win-win-win model, where everybody gets a fair slice of the pie. And the monetization is not just the platform, it's the data owner, it's the innovator, and it's the platform as well. So it's the data then that is the fuel to drive these business models as we move towards the token economy. And what blockchain gives us, of course, is the ability for people to share their data, to create trusted data at the level of the market without giving up power to a central database. So that core problem that we've fixed is, how can I create that trusted data without giving power to the central authority, the central database? And you think of the airline example. If you don't trust the guy in the middle, how can you share your data and have this efficient market? You can't. And this really is the core problem that we fixed. And if you think of that core problem, if you think of it like being a stone kind of thrown into a pond, there you can see in the center of my pond that problem, no trusted data without giving power to a central database. If you look at how that kind of flips out across the whole piece, then it means that because you're not controlling your digital identity, we have real problems over access to financial services. A third of the world, for example, don't have access to banking. We don't have control of our identities. That before Bitcoin, there was no digitally native payments on the internet. So payments are very slow, very expensive, lots of reconciliation. There's just a ton of paperwork in trying to reconcile a trade. What was the price? What was the quantity? What was the received? What was the quality? Paperwork, reconciliation left, right, and center, loads of disputes, hugely inefficient, very slow and manual to do that reconciliation, and then really slow and expensive to do the payment to transfer value when you then to come to close out that deal, which means that we have real lack of liquidity in markets. We don't have that visibility and provenance of assets as they move up and down a supply chain. You can only, typically in B2B processes, you can only see one step up and one step down in the supply chain. You can't see across the whole supply chain, and you have really no clue as to the provenance of the items that you're buying. How do you know whether something is counterfeit or is real? And there's a difficulty to build new business models around illiquid assets. Things like trying to monetize and trade in illiquid assets like fine wines or art or all these non-functional tokens. So these are the problems that we're looking to fix. And if we start with the banking industry and then say, how are the banks starting to use this token economy to start to fix some of these problems? And I've gone from a stone thrown into a pond. I'm now using Russian dolls, but you can see my stone at the center. That's the smallest little doll in my Russian dolls there, and that's the data at the center. That's the asset. That's the information that we're using to trade in our marketplaces. And increasingly, this is going to become digitized as it becomes a security token. So we've tokenized the ownership of something. So it could be digital or it could be physical. It could be something like a bag of cobalt, where you have a non-functional token for it, where maybe you spray DNA spray on the top of the bag. So you can take something unique and digitize that onto the blockchain, so you're confident about that bag of cobalt. It could be a value for transferring value in a payment piece, crypto or a stable coin, or it could be this utility token, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And if you fix that piece at the center, then we're now getting that visibility and provenance, and we're now getting that liquidity in the markets. And if we look at the sequence in which banks are starting to adopt this pattern, then we have to start with identity. And, that's a super interesting question, to ask yourself, identity and compliance, because in the world of Bitcoin, of course, this is a pseudo-anonymous environment. And if you're doing cash transactions, you want to be anonymous. That's a core part of democracy and fairness, not to have this big brother or anybody able to monitor what you're doing. So in order to take this pattern and move it into enterprise, there has in the past been a trade-off in decentralization, as in order to cope with know your customer, know your transaction, anti-money laundering, we've had to give up a little bit of decentralization in order to have permissioned access, in order to have that identity. And I think what's happening, and as we move forward into the future, that difference between the permissioned and the permissionless world is going to become much more gray. We're going to have a much more seamless integration between public and private, much more of a hybrid environment, where you think of something like Baseline on Ethereum, here that project is starting to introduce privacy using things like zero knowledge proofs at the level of the transaction. So you're starting to get that privacy in a public paradigm. So we start with things like identity, then we move into things like compliance. And Bitcoin, of course, comes about because we had the financial crisis back in 2007. Well, why did Lehman go bust? Well, they went bust because nobody could track who was holding the collateral for what. So things like collateral tracking is a really good compliance use case for blockchain. Then we move into the whole payment space, tokenization of assets. And this could, of course, be tokenization of anything. I'm working with one client where we're really starting to look at tokenizing, fine wines, paintings, all sorts of non-fungible tokens, where you can start to create a revenue stream and you can start to create new types of trading and new types of markets, which is really, really interesting. And then as we get further out onto our pond, we're doing things like responsible banking. There's one super project I love called Plastic Bank, where they're bringing banking to the unbanked in third world countries. And the way that they've cracked the identity problem is really interesting. These are people who don't have a government identity. So how do you create an identity against which you can lend? Well, their model is, collectors go out to collect plastic bottles to stop them going into the ocean. And they get a credit for this, which they can then spend. So they're basically using a stable coin, a utility token, which they can then spend with local service providers. But of course, and the reason this works in third world countries is, amazingly enough, even the poorest people can get access to a smartphone. So you can then start to build up a reputation service and then start to lend against that reputation service. So this is how I see banks starting to think about tokenization and the sequence of how they're starting to roll out the token economy in finance. And when we try to think about how to define a token taxonomy, the simplest one I've seen, I stole from Lisa Tan. You may know Lisa, she's very well known on social media. And she just talks about the sum model, security, utility, or money stroke value. And I find this high level model very useful in how to think about classifying tokens, digital assets. That security representing the ownership, whether it's fungible or non-fungible, the utility effectively being the incentive, and then the value being the money piece. Your smart contract underneath, of course, implementing the logic and an autonomous business model behind that. And then the blockchain being the event store, decentralized event store to keep those events and that knowledge of trades and the knowledge of movement of that asset across its life cycle, across the ecosystem. If we step out to other industries, I drew this chart, and of course, we're seeing this token economy starting to appear in every industry. I've just put a few up here by example. So at the bottom, we have our technical foundations, our platform. And as I mentioned before, we're starting to see a real hybrid now of public and private. Corda is working with Xinfin, Hyperledger Fabric is working with Hashgraph, Ethereum has the baseline, so they're doing all within one protocol. So I think hybrid of public and private is becoming very much the way I see enterprise moving forward. As we have those foundations where we worry a little bit less about whether it's permissioned or permissionless, and we use the best of both to solve our problem. At the next level up, we have our networks, be they networks in insurance or health or industrial. And Here, this, I think, is where the utility token starts to become super useful. And we're starting to see networks using this as an internal governance mechanism within these ecosystems to control behavior within the ecosystem. So for example, to encourage certain folks to participate, to maybe share the benefits across the members a little bit more fairly, and to use these tokens for access to services, to pay for services, just like the plastic bank was doing. And then up at the application level, this is where we have the business model being built for individual applications. So, we have the model running from the bottom to the top, but we have individual models running for each of these use cases. For example, if we think about that bag of cobalt, well, if you look at your phone or your laptop or your car, one of the really big problems today is, well, where did the cobalt and the other minerals come from that's in your battery? And of course, a lot of them come from, slave labor, child labor. So, one project that I'm working with is using non-functional tokens. You spray this DNA spray on the bag of cobalt. You use that digitized on the blockchain to track from the mine to the smelter. And then you use this utility token to help to change the behavior of the local communities, rather like the plastic bank, to make it in their interest to follow the rules and to play by the rules, earn these tokens, and then use them to buy services in the community, again, like plastic bank. And here, that to get around the identity problem, they're scanning the back of people's retinas and then taking an image of the retina, to use that for identity. So there's a whole bunch of use cases where the enterprise is starting to think about how they can use these tokens and how they can use the digital economy to solve problems. We also see it in sustainable supply chains. One of the first projects I worked on was looking at recycling and circular economy. And, how do you know when you're buying something, a cup of coffee or something, how do you know where the packaging has come from? How do you know where the paper has come from? Has it come from a sustainable source? Is are trees going to be planted to replace the trees that have used the paper to make your packaging? And again, this is where the provenance comes in, just like the non-functional token for the cobalt. And this is also where the incentive model comes in, that utility token, where there's one network I'm working with in Switzerland where they are using that utility token as a reward. So the consumer of the coffee, in this case, can gift the tokens back to the original coffee farmer. And one of the problems in coffee supply chains is that small farmers get terribly squeezed and really suffer a lot from the bigger players in the supply chain, and they can easily go out of business. So this is a way of linking the actual coffee grower with the actual consumer, and then using this to change behavior and to encourage this circular economy and to encourage a democratization of the value within that supply chain. So these are examples of where we're starting to see the token economy poke its head up in the enterprise world. But if we think about the business model, this collaborative business model, we need to be moving now into an environment where we have this trusted data at the level of the market without the central database. So where is this going to come from? And this is where we need to have business models that are very open and neutral, so that competitors are happy to be on the same blockchain side by side with their competitors. And we need an appropriate level of privacy so that they're comfortable to put their transactions into this database, into this blockchain. You know, you think about that airline example, we need to be creating an environment where you can govern your data and who gets to see that data. So this is where this privacy thing starts to come in, and we start to be using some of these things like that baseline where you're starting to hide transactions in a public space. You know, one of the patterns that I'm starting to see is, you know, where is the best place to hide a tree? Well, you could hide a tree in a walled garden, but if success is determined by, well, how many trees do I have in my walled garden, my private enterprise network, then it is less successful than if I can have a huge forest. So how do we have the huge forest, but we can obfuscate the data? We can make it impossible to really identify patterns and identify who is behind that transaction. And these are the patterns that are starting to become really important as that difference between public and private is starting to become gray. This then is the foundations, the collaboration of our platform, our marketplace platform. But on top of that, we have a new type of models that are starting to evolve, which are based around innovation and competition. And here, this is much more what we're used to in terms of competitive buying and selling of data, and the creation now of apps which could start to compete. So at the lower level, we're only going to have one app doing one job on the protocol because we want it on the marketplace because we want to get synergies and network effects. But at a higher level, we could have competing applications. And this is where I'm starting to see companies selling their data, tokenizing their data. So literally tokenizing transactions and selling the key effectively as data, which somebody else can then use in their business model. We're seeing models where people are selling expertise. So that's their smart contract that they've written. Or where you stick the two together and you've got insight and maybe you add in some AI or something like that. So we're starting to see at this higher level a real buying and selling, a real competitive, a new type of marketplace emerging on top of these collaborative foundations. And because we can have multiple industries, multiple of those ecosystems on the same basic platform, you start to get cross-industry fertilization, and the boundaries between industries start to merge and become gray. So your next competitor may well be coming from an adjacent industry rather than a traditional industry. So this is the new models that we're starting to see. And if I introduced a third analogy, I've had a stone thrown into a pond. I've had Russian dolls, and now I'm going to have a skyscraper. But the way that I think it's going to go, if we look at our skyscraper, at the bottom, we've got our technical foundations. So this is our immutable event store, our decentralized platform. And this is the very open collaborative model at the base. And then we need to layer in identity, whether it be pseudo-anonymous or KYC, KYT. We need the digitally native payment. So you can pay digitally with a crypto or with stablecoin. We need to be able to tokenize just about anything. So that bag of cobalt, so you've now got a bag of cobalt as a token you can start to trade, whether fungible or non-fungible. And then we're moving up into that supply chain and then the marketplace as you move towards the buyers and sellers of data. And what I'm seeing is effectively two types of business models that are being stuck together like a sandwich, where at the bottom, this is a very open, democratic, very fair, on-chain governance, stopping the unfair pricing control of that private club, you know, stopping that ticketing organization in the airline exploiting its position. So very, very important to have decentralization there, and very much a cost plus kind of model. And then on the layer above, this is where we then have that marketplace, buyers and sellers of data, and very much a value-based pricing model, and where the innovators are coming in and building new value props. And these are the platform business models that are starting to emerge. And I think there's kind of a holy trinity, really, as to how these models work. And right at the center is the utility token. And I think that is the magic sauce to make this whole model work, where we have those incentives to drive the behaviors that we want. You know, think about the plastic bank, think about that Cobalt.
Andy, I want to jump in there real quick. There's been quite a few questions and very active chat. Chat's been quite active, which is in a good way. There's been a lot of going back and forth. And so I want to give some of our guests and attendees a chance for their questions to be answered. So Christine, if you will just jump in and.
Sure. Well, I'm going to go down the list because there are a few things. But
sure.
The first set of questions focused on security.
Okay.
And Chip had asked that Chip, can you just answer your question, because you heard a few things, but he was asking about the zero trust networks. The blockchain does not have implementation for best security practices with the enterprise environment because there's too much risk. And like, what do you think about that? He also mentioned like data as a commodity.
Well, so when we see these two worlds coming together, you know, I mean, I know Richard Brown quite well. He's the CTO of Corda. He's ex-IBM. We grew up together in WebSphere. And, you know, why did he go off and create Corda? You know, why did IBM go off and create Fabric? It's because these enterprise requirements are of a different caliber. So we needed these separate protocols. But my point of view is there's been a trade-off in the level of decentralization in order to achieve the level of privacy and the enterprise requirements that are needed. And I think this has given us a halfway house between that airline example and the vision of the token economy. So we've only gone halfway, we haven't gone the whole way. And I think to go the whole way, we really need to embrace the consumer and the way that the consumer will drive changed behavior. And that very much sits in the public world. So we need to bring these two together. And there's two separate ways that I see this hybrid coming about. And this is early days, right? But either we see an interoperability between the public and the private, and that's exactly what Corda are doing. They're working with XINFIN, with XDC, so you can then have that public-private marriage. IBM is working very closely with Hedera Hashgraph, you know, again to do that. So you've got your decentralized clock, you've got your sort of your token platform, your identity platform, and then you've maybe got your enterprise requirements on the back end. And I've been looking a little bit at Baseline. I wouldn't pretend to be, I'm not technical, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, but I'm a huge fan of Paul Brody. So I listen to everything that Paul says. He's so Ernst Young and Accenture and Microsoft and Consensus are driving this. And when you listen to what he's talking about, he talks about adding, he says, if you think of version of the early days of the internet, it was HTTP.
Right.
And I can remember that, and there's no way I'd have put my credit card on the internet at that stage. And then along comes HTTPS, and everybody's happy to put their credit card on. So there's a whole load of work that community is doing to try and say, well, can we give that extra level of privacy on an open protocol? And I know of other networks, open protocols that are going down that same route. Now, I'm not technical, so I'm not going to try and answer your question maybe at the deepest technical level. I just want to share what I'm seeing. But I do think there's a real need to stick these two things together, public and private. And I think that is the key to the enterprise really moving into the token economy. So
well, your main problem with that is you have one centralized idea that is not ever being addressed in any of these presentations I ever look about, is government oversight and regulation. You know, because congratulations, you said public, private. Therefore, there must be standardized rules that are played by IEEE, NIST compliances, PCI. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. You know, when you're dealing in the Fed space and you're dealing with public-private information, you're of course you say privacy. I understand completely where you're coming from on that. And that has to be ensured by certain standards that are not out there in the public domain yet for what they're going to say. You say, okay, well, I want to be able to do these things, and I want to have all this grandiose idea of being able to track down all my hyperledgers and so forth. From a simple as a security guy, you have no cyber kill chain. You have no way of backtracking those things back out. Decentralizing cybersecurity is one of the worst ideas you could ever come up with anywhere on the planet. You talk to any security person, they are not going to want to decentralize any of their security. They're going to want to accumulate their security in one centralized repository and so forth. So when you look at, the economic model, say for example, with IBM and Watson and all the kind of great stuff that you do with AI and integration, these things, you cannot decentralize those actual repositories and those systems on those databases. They have to be collectively put together. So within the governance model of being able to do that, you look at tokenization, you take a look at, on-grid, off-grid, and you take a look at how you want to have those things as an open business model. There's a high level of risk that's involved with all this and vulnerabilities, because what you see happening in the blockchain industry, and is the same thing that you see with the problems in the crypto industry. So if I can steal cryptocurrency, that means I can steal blockchain all day long. I can steal the caching, I can steal the hashing, I've got rainbow tables. I mean, there are still a lot of technical problems that have to be addressed, that yet, we have these grandiose ideas, but when you come down to the security and the grounding of being able to do this in the banking industry, when you're in the pharmaceutical industry, in the medical industry, it is a very taboo thing right now because there's no government oversight, there's no government regulation. Insurance companies and cybersecurity insurance won't cover this, and as a business model, it has a high level of risk only unless you are an enterprise-based system that can throw a ton of money at it to be able to put out that infrastructure to be able to show those things as a business model that's going to be repetitive, that's going to be able to show a profitable dollar at the end of the day.
But right. Chip, but we're just talking about business models overall and how things are changing. It doesn't mean right this very second everything's going to be there. And I think security is a very important topic to cover, and I don't think that's something we're going to particularly cover now, but we could, have a small discussion on it perhaps and see what Andy thinks, like he was just talking about. But there are a lot of things going on, and there may not be all the standards out there now, but there is a lot of research going on and guidelines being made and things like that. Because we're going backwards, the blockchain technology was out there before the standards were actually made, so we're kind of playing catch up. But it's good to address all those things, and that's why it's good for people like you we could take all that into consideration.
See, that's why you have people like me, because I'm such a pain in the ass to bring it up every single time.
But there are people that do focus just on security, and we will try to get one of them in to focus on that. But what Andy's talking about is like the big picture, once things are moving on, and in some places they are, and he's talking about public and private melding together, and how that's how everything's going to really start being able to work in the future, and security is a big part of that.
So true, and I agree with Andy on one. I agree with Andy on one thing is, yes, you'll have to have a public-private partnership, but the other thing though too is it all boils down to one thing: what is the law? Because when it all comes down to it, it comes down to the law. What is on paper and on pen, pen and paper, that says, and in a court of law that says this is what is liable, not liable, this is the precedent, this was not the precedent, and that is one of the key things that we have to take a look at is, when we are doing all this exploration of all this stuff is, what are the laws and the bylaws that we have to be able to follow by this, because someone will eventually sue.
And people are doing that. And there's also blockchain governance, which in July, we're actually going to have three talks. That's a series about that. We'll be addressing those types of things. What to think of, because we're talking about international laws, company laws, intra-company laws, and how everything works together everywhere with regulations. And it's very complicated. So that's blockchain governance, I believe, focuses on a lot of those types of details. So we're gonna move on with our questions. So a little bit more, Chip. Not that I'm trying to ignore you, but I want Andy to get back into what he's talking about. And there's a couple other things that we could talk about, and we can, at the end, if you have more questions, we'll talk to you, okay?
No problem.
Hi,
Okay.
Andy, this is Justin Cooper.
That was a super question. And I mean, in summary, I mean, I see centralization to decentralization as a scale, you know, with lots of grays in the middle, right? And I'm presenting it as sort of, you know, left or right, black or white, but the reality is there's a whole load of gray in the middle. And each use case is going to be down to its merits, right? You know, is what you can do and what you can't do, what you do choose to do, what you don't choose to do. But I do think that the marriage of these two worlds is necessary to really bring the consumer into this, to reinvent industries. And that's something that I'm quite passionate about. And I did say at the beginning, I'm trying to look forward as to what I think is coming, as opposed to what's here right now.
Right. Yeah. And if we stop and we couldn't have, we need to continue doing a focus on what could happen, and other people are focusing on those other things like the security piece. But we don't want to like stop moving on to what can happen until like all the security stuff's taken care of. Do you know what I mean? And then maybe prevent like innovation from going on. Okay, so I'm gonna go down the list. There was a few other questions while you were speaking, Andy, about the specific example that you were talking about. Sorry, there was something here about the airline industry, or who specifically were you talking about? I think I'm trying to look for the question.
Well, that was my question. I can repeat it if you want.
Great, thank you.
Oh, I'm not that familiar with the airline industry, so I was thinking, or I was wondering if you could actually name a company of who is that centralized entity, because isn't there a ton of competition for those booking agencies? So,
I know Paul got into a little bit of a trouble about actually mentioning the airline, so he now talks about it generically. So I've been a bit naughty, and I've literally taken his story because I thought it was so good. You know, so we're talking about, and I want to be a little bit careful because this is going out on public. I think really it's more about the pattern, and this is going right back to the 70s, right? So I mean, this is, you know, 30, 40, 50 years ago now. But I think the point I was trying to make is this is an age-old problem. You know, it's not something which is new. And that's the problem of, in a business-to-business environment, if they need to share data to service the customer. And here's a great example where if I want to buy a ticket, which is going from Delta to American, I need to have some way of sticking that data together. You need somebody in the middle to make that happen. And the pattern is that can work exceedingly well and make very efficient markets as long as everybody trusts that central player, right? And as long as that central player is highly regulated, highly governed, that's the super model, right? But it does break down, and an awful lot of unfair pricing and exploitation of that position has taken place in the past. And that's the problem that we're trying to fix as we move forward to these kind of new marketplaces, where this is why I say going from the private club to the token economy, you know, the private club being this small group of players that basically control the market, and how can we ensure, you know, the fairness in markets, and that's the pattern that we're trying to create as we create new types of marketplaces. And you know, the role of the regulator is key. Potentially the role of I mean, for example, I was working in the very first one I was working on network I was working on down in Australia. There were 31 banks that wanted to get together to create a new marketplace, and there were 3 or 4 banks that were leading this, and the regulator was involved in day one. And you know, the regulator said, well, okay guys, I'm going to let you do this as long as you can convince me that bank 31 can compete on this marketplace with the same level playing field as bank number 1. Because the 2 or 3 banks at the top end had a large market share, right? So it's trying to do this, and it's trying to become ever more decentralized, and it's a journey, you know, and we take little step by little step, and the enterprise businesses that we're used to are quite centralized in their infrastructure. They've had decades and decades of building these centralized infrastructures, and we're slowly trying to decentralize them and move towards these new patterns. So I've deliberately not answered your question because I'm remembering that Paul got into trouble for this. And I tried to do it more in principle. So sorry, I went on that directly because of that.
So Andy, I'm wondering, or I'd like your thoughts, if maybe the solution is already out there and potentially exists, but it's more on the developer's lack of integration or adoption, specifically ERC 725 and ERC 735.
Well, certainly my perspective, I'm a non-technical person, I'm a business person. And if I think back of the conversations I've had over the last 4 or 5 years, there've been an awful lot of conversations in the business and the governance bubbles on my little chart and the incentive bubbles on my little chart here. So there are a lot of conversations which need to take place as well as the technology conversations. And a lot of that is going to be around agreeing the standards. And the more that we can agree the standards, then the whole load easier it's going to be to start to build these marketplaces.
But if the standards already exist and are part of Ethereum, that process could be fast cycled. Right?
Indeed, but bear in mind, we're not necessarily building everything on Ethereum, right?
This is true.
Yeah. Well, Justin is. I'm sorry.
Well, the cross-chaining options
I was just teasing.
now afford a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating how everything's going to be able to work together at some point. And how I think all the different sides are seeing that, and it's just opening up a world of possibilities now. I have one more question on here that I just want to cover, and I think we'll let Andy finish, and then we'll finish asking more questions, because I'm not sure how many more slides he has left. But
I've almost finished actually, but carry on, Christine.
Well, I'll just ask you, the one thing was about the coffee example, and they were asking if there's any mining for the token, or does Coffee Shop just create the token? Right.
So this one is Farmer Connect, which is run out of Switzerland, Zurich, Sucrafina, and I'm 99%, well, 98% sure that the team built that on Fabric, and they built the tokens on Hyperledger Fabric. And I don't believe there's therefore any mining involved. There's no proof of work on that pattern. I do know the local team. I could reach out and ask them where they are now, but I'm pretty certain. So, I mean, that's one example where we were playing with building tokens on Fabric. We did have Fab Token at one point, which was a framework for building tokens. That was deprecated in 2.0, I think. But you can still build tokens on Fabric with chain code, but not with proof of work. Obviously, we don't have that level of decentralization. Okay, so I think we're going to let you finish with your slides now, and then whoever has questions after that, we'll just have like an open question session. If that's okay. Okay. Well, I pretty much finished really, in terms of looking forward, but I mean the next chart is kind of what I see as being the transaction superhighway for Web 1.0. So, Web 1.0, of course, was the information superhighway. So this is where information is effectively copied from place to place. If you're going to do that at a transaction level, then you need a new infrastructure, without the middleman, hence the blockchain. And in order for this transaction superhighway to work, I think we have the 3 components at the top, which are the foundations to this superhighway, which is something around identity. And there's going to be a whole range of pseudo-anonymous reputation all the way through to KYC, KYT. Obviously, the provenance, visibility, transparency of supply chains, and the native payments, and of course, fiat or crypto. All of those components give you the marketplace where you can start to have this buying and selling of data, innovation, new applications being built. Tokenization of those assets is the real lubricant to open up those marketplaces to new types of trading patterns, new types of liquidity. Think about that bag of cobalt, tokenized. At the moment, it's only on the primary market. The secondary market is all done off-chain, but soon you'll be able to do the secondary market on-chain. So they have another channel where you can fractionalize that bag of cobalt, break it up in little bits. You can start trading palladium for cobalt. All sorts of interesting new trading patterns that weren't possible before. Got another network where starting to think about, fine wines, watches, stuff like that. So all sorts of interesting stuff you can tokenize and put into these marketplaces. And then I think the thing which makes all of this work is the incentive model. And I think the magic glue is going to be that utility token, which you're using at each of the three levels in my model, at the platform level, at the ecosystem level, and at the individual app level. And I think that is the tool that gives the governing function the ability to really start to change behaviors and really start to get some adoption. And the 2 or 3 examples that I've seen so far where people are just putting their toes in the water, where we're in that sort of responsible sourcing around cobalt, the stuff around circular supply chain with paper, and the one with coffee. So there's 2 or 3 where folks are just starting to play with that, but they're all small scale. They're all putting the toe in the water. But I think very much that's the direction. So in summary, I've drawn this as, left or right, going from that private club where that model can work, but you have to trust the guy at the center. And if you trust the guy at the center, that's great. Or we move to this new world, this token economy with on-chain governance, with utility tokens, driving new economic models. The reality is, of course, there's a ton of gray in the middle, right? And you look at a lot of what we've done so far, we've taken, if there's 10 steps from left to right, we're maybe on the second or, if generous, the third step out of those 10. We've got another 7 to go, And a lot of people look at what we've done so far and they say, well, it's still quite centralized. It's still pretty close to that private club. But we have taken the first 2 or 3 steps towards the token economy, but we've got a load more work to do. And I think the thing that's really going to move us on to step 4 and 5 as we move towards the right is where we start to see the marriage of public and private, and we start to open up to the consumer, and we start to reinvent industries from the end customer, not just the B2B side of things. And I think that's the next phase of blockchain adoption over the next 2, 3, 4 years. Just starting to see it. I think from a personal point of view, that's where the action is going, in my opinion. So that, I think, was my last slide. You've already given me some really tough questions, so thank you for that.
Great, thanks, Andy. I wanted to give Hadiza a second. She had a couple, or this individual, sorry, didn't want to assume anything. Had a few questions, a couple of questions a few chats ago. Wanted to give you an opportunity to ask a question.
Thank you so much. Very kind. Thank you, Andy. Very fascinating talk. I had a question about self-sovereign identity, and your thoughts on that as being a factor in, helping to decentralize and control who is managing our data. Could you talk on that?
Well, yes. So I'm quite passionate about identity, and you'll notice on all of my slides, I've always got identity right at the center of my pond, right at the center of my Russian dolls, or right at the foundations of my building. And I think all the dimensions of identity are phenomenally important. What I'm seeing so far are things like reputation services, pseudo anonymity, things like that. I love the idea of self-sovereign ID. So I suffer from multiple sclerosis, and I'll tell you that here in the UK, trying to get access to services is just a pain in the neck. You have to reprove the same information time after time. It's really slow to get access to services. You're totally reliant on the central NHS, which is just this monster where they haven't really got a clue what they're doing. I would love to take control of my health identity. And I think things like health and skills, taking some control of that is super interesting. Now, clearly, I can't declare myself to be a citizen of the United States. I'm a Brit. So we need the issuer of the credential. So this is the issue, hold, verify pattern. So self-sovereign ID still relies on the credential issuer and the ability to verify that credential issuer in the trust over IP pattern. But I think that's just such a powerful pattern. And I just see so many use cases falling off the back of that. And I worry a little bit. I know that in Europe, yesterday or today, it might have been yesterday, there was a big new EU directive around mandating digital identity to be fully recognized across all EU states, one digital identity. I've read the papers and nowhere did I see the word decentralized or blockchain or even self-sovereign ID. So I really hope that when we do implement digital identity, we really do it in a decentralized fashion and take those principles of self-sovereign ID. I'm quite passionate about it. So I'm a big fan of that.
Thanks. And then Adam had a question. It says, in some countries, crypto is banned and tokenized assets tend to get mixed up in that. Can IBM and other organizations work on policy to help clarify this?
Yeah, I mean, I think Christine started to talk a little bit about that as well. So all the guidance, the rules, the governance, all of these standards are kind of being laid. Everything I've said today has been in a personal capacity. I do want to stress that. This is what I think. And IBM started with, blockchain, not Bitcoin. And we were deliberately not in crypto assets to start with. I think if you look at what's happening with decentralized finance in banking, I think this is becoming so important so quickly. I don't think anybody can ignore it. So I think there is a sea change happening as the enterprise world is starting to wake up about this. But on that journey, from the left to the right, step 1 through to step 10, at best we're at step 2 or 3 on that journey, right? And how we progress through steps 4, 5, and 6 is yet to be seen. And a core part of that is a general acceptance of Bitcoin and crypto. And I think we're getting really close. You see an awful lot of wealth managers now offering crypto assets. You see an awful lot of banks starting to think about custody services. I think it's kind of happening by the back door. I personally think it's unstoppable, but that's a personal opinion. So again, not really answered your question, just like the one about identifying the players in the airline industry. I'm trying not to get myself into too much trouble here.
And it looks like the last question from Justin again. Thanks, Justin, for the questions and the inquiries. Do you think there will be a pushback or lack of adoption from the identity/KYC verification requirements, negating the core tenet of anonymity?
Oh, well, great question. And I did answer that. And I think it comes down to use case, right? And if you think about things like cash transactions, it is just so important, right now, if I do a cash transaction, it's entirely anonymous. And I think there's something about that which we simply cannot afford to lose. So as we move towards genuinely digital currency, I think we have to protect that anonymity. And I think there's a range of use cases, and you start with that just that cash piece where I think you have to have the anonymity, and then you move more into the regulated space where you have to have KYC, KYT. And I would like to see both ends of that spectrum being supported. So I don't think it's an either or an or. I think it's a both. But I do think we have to keep that anonymity piece as well. I think that's fundamental to what's in the foundations of this building. So there's a real philosophy piece about that, and I think that anonymity piece at the bottom is really important. You know, which is why things like reputation services are really, you know, quite helpful, where it's pseudo-anonymous, it's not identifiable. I think that pattern will always be important.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time here. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us, and be sure to look out for our next sessions. Thank you again so much, Andy, for the talk and for everything today. Be sure to look out, folks, for our next series, which will be a series of talks like this and a workshop in July. And we'll be posting Andy's talk and recording of the session on our website here very shortly. Thanks all. Thank you, Andy.
And thank you for all the great questions. You fried me a fair amount.
Be sure to follow Andy on LinkedIn, because he posts every day really great questions and conversations. So it's like this talk that he just did now. You could do that almost every day with Andy. He's wonderful.
Yeah, very true.
Okay, thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you all. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone. That was awesome.
Bye.